Hello and welcome to the April Nutritional Therapy webinar for Project U or the Project U Academy. My name is Whitney Isles. I'm your facilitator for today. I am the nutritional therapist that is working with Project U Academy, and today we are doing a webinar on understanding PMDD. So before we begin, this webinar is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. Always consult a qualified health professional for personal health concerns and your journey in understanding this is your digestive system. What I mean is your own kind of health and well-being is essential, and we aim to equip you with valuable insights and knowledge. Now, before we go any further, I do want to add a trigger warning to this webinar this evening because we will be speaking about mental health issues, and there will be mentions of suicide or suicidal ideation and suicidal thoughts. So if these things are not kind of within your bandwidth for the time being, maybe just kind of pause now and come back to the webinar at a later date. Okay. So, like I said previously, my name is Whitney Isles. I'm the nutritional therapist at Project U Academy. I work in a trauma-informed way in my kind of day job or my career prior to becoming a nutritional therapist. I am a trauma specialist and work through a kind of psychodynamic psychotherapeutic framework. I'm also a neurodivergent girly, so bear with me because I go through the same kind of cognitive dysfunction and brain fog and memory issues and getting myself tongue-tied, there we go, as everyone else, okay? So what are we covering this evening? So what I would like to look at is kind of what is PMDD and what it isn't, what's happening to your body and your brain, why being neurodivergent makes this more complicated, and what can actually help, and how to advocate for yourself. So like I said before, this is a huge subject. We can get through, I'm going to try my best to get through a lot in this kind of hour webinar without hopefully overwhelming you. But again, I could make this a 2-hour training, a 3-hour training. There is so much detail that we can get into when it comes to PMDD. So I wanted to start off with the basics and kind of think about this is about people who menstruate, and this is about people who menstruate. Well, this is about people who menstruate and the menstrual cycle kind of typically being between 21 and 35 days. So that's kind of the typical average. For some people, it might be 28 days every month. For some other people, it might be 32 days. And for others, that might kind of fluctuate. So one month it might be 25, the next month it might be 35. Different things can affect your kind of menstruation or your menstrual cycle. So if you've been traveling, for example, if you've been particularly stressed out, so there's kind of factors that can kind of influence the length of your cycle. But essentially, we're talking about the cycle that kind of prepares the female body or the menstruating body for pregnancy, and it results in the shredding of the uterine lining, right? So that's your menstruation, that's your period, right? And that's if fertilization does not occur. And it involves 4 main phases. So the menstrual phase, the follicular phase, the ovulation, and luteal phase. And it's regulated by kind of mainly hormones, estrogen and progesterone. It's going to be so much fun having to continue to say those 2 words at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday evening. Bear with me, all right? So when we're thinking about the menstrual cycle, we're thinking about kind of your menses, so your menstrual phase, so that is your period. And roughly that can last between 1 and 5 days. For other people, that might be a little bit longer, okay? We're kind of talking around averages here, but average doesn't necessarily kind of work for everyone. But we think about kind of the menstrual phase as the first day of bleeding, where the uterus shreds its lining because no pregnancy has occurred. And then we think about the follicular phase, which is days 1 to 13. So you'll notice that the menstrual phase is included in that kind of follicular phase as well. So a lot of the times when we are doing things like seed cycling, for example, it will look mainly at the follicular phase and the luteal phase because we're looking at days kind of 1 to 13 and then 14 to 28, right? The follicular phase is triggered by the follicle stimulating hormone, so FSH, and it's kind of It's around the kind of the ovary kind of maturing the ovary, releasing estrogen, and the kind of the thickening of the uterine lining. So it's essentially getting the uterus ready for pregnancy. It's getting the uterus ready for ovulation and then kind of potential pregnancy, right? Then you have the ovulation phase. So ovulation is around day 14. And again, that can be affected by stress and about other things. And for different people, it doesn't happen exactly on day 14. It might fluctuate slightly, right? Um, and again, this is when we're thinking about when the mature egg is being released into the ovary from the fallopian tubes. And then finally, we have the luteal phase. And this is the phase that a lot of people tend to be a little bit more aware of, because this is when kind of the hormone levels drop and we start to get ready for our period. So this is when we start to experience kind of some changes in energy levels, where we might be feeling kind of more snacky, where we might have a little bit more PMS. This is the phase kind of leading up to period, leading up to the menstrual cycle. Okay. So what is PMDD? PMDD is the full name is the premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and it is a very severe form of premenstrual syndrome, so PMS. It causes a range of emotional and physical symptoms every month during the week or two before your period, and it is sometimes referred to as severe PMS. When someone might experience PMDD, so it will happen, like I said, in that week or two before the menstrual cycle, in between ovulation and menstruation, and it cannot last up to those 2 weeks. There's a lot of debate on, is PMDD a mental health disorder? Now, because PMDD has symptoms, or kind of has mental health symptoms that can affect your mental well-being and your emotions, it is listed in the DSM-5. So the DSM-5, for those of you who are not aware, it's the kind of the book psychiatrists use, or the book that kind of psychology uses, or mainly psychiatry uses, in order to uh, diagnose different mental health disorders. I say that a bit tongue in cheek because it is highly debatable, or kind of highly pushed back on by a lot of people, especially because we know like kind of autism and ADHD, all of these things are found in the DSM-5, right? So that's a whole rabbit hole that we can go down to another day. But it's the book, it's the American book that's used by psychiatrists to kind of put down the signs and the symptoms of different mental health disorders. However, medical professionals still consider PMDD a endocrine disorder, so a disorder of the hormonal system, right? And as we get into that, we'll still see that even that is a little bit debatable, right? So I think the thing is to be aware of with PMDD, there's still a lot of research that needs to go into it, and there's still a lot of research coming out. And even within the research and the medical fields, what we can find is there can be conflicts there in between kind of different medical and health professionals. So what I'm going to try and do today is kind of give you an overview of what are some of the information out there, but then also attune that to some of the stuff that we already know about neurodivergence. And it's important to understand that when we do get into the kind of the subject of PMDD and neurodivergence, there is not enough research, right? We know this when it comes to studying us, when it comes to kind of really studying women's and women's health. And then when we think about kind of neurodivergence and people who menstruate, again, there is just not enough research coming out there. So a lot of things I'll flag up when we know that there's not enough research, but it's always important to kind of bear that in mind when we're talking about kind of things like PMDD. So when we're thinking about the symptoms, the emotional and behavioral symptoms are kind of fall under the subjects of like mood swings, feeling upset or tearful, for example, if you feel that others are rejecting you, lack of energy, lack of interest in activities you normally enjoy, feeling hopeless, feeling angry or irritable, or kind of rage, coming into conflict with people around you, feeling anxious, tense or on edge, feeling overwhelmed or out of control, having difficulty concentrating, and having suicidal thoughts, right? These are all symptoms that were on the Mind website. The physical symptoms for PMDD include breast tenderness or swelling, pain in your muscles and joints, headaches, feeling bloated, changes in your appetite, such as overeating or having specific food cravings, and sleep problems. Now, what causes PMDD? So PMDD is caused by an abnormal, heightened sensitivity to the natural rises and fall of estrogen and progesterone during the menstrual cycle. It is not just about a hormone imbalance. It is about a highly sensitive system, and this sensitive system causing kind of abnormal reactions or atypical reactions to something that is um, very normal to have, right? It's very normal to have a menstrual cycle and have these kind of hormones change throughout the month. But what we're seeing with PMDD is this kind of heightened sensitivity to these changes, right? It can also be described as a severe negative reaction in the brain that is directly connected to the natural hormonal fluctuations of the menstrual cycle and is triggered when ovulation occurs. So even here, with these different explanations, what we're seeing is it's actually not just an endocrine issue, right? So the definitions before were making it out to be an endocrine issue, right? A hormone issue. Now, when we start to think about what some of these causes are for PMDD, we're starting to see that this is also about the nervous system. This is all also about this heightened sensitivity of the nervous system and what's going on in the brain. And then we have, so however, others such as the Johns Hopkins Medical Institute state that the exact cause of PMDD is not known. It may be an abnormal reaction to normal hormone changes that happen with each menstrual cycle. The hormone changes can cause a serotonin deficiency. Serotonin is a substance naturally found in the brain and intestines that narrows blood vessels and can affect mood and cause physical symptoms, right? So then this John Hopkins kind of description of what causes PMDD says, well, actually, we don't know. We don't really know the ins and outs of this, but they've also then brought in a additional layer to this. So we're already thinking about kind of endocrine system and hormones. Then we're thinking about nervous system and kind of what's going on in the brain. And then we start thinking about serotonin and that, yes, that is a neurotransmitter, but we know that 95% of serotonin is produced in the gut, right? And it's in the intestines. So we are now also bringing the gut into this as well. So this is becomes a whole systems approach to understanding PMDD. So again, if you was to do a Google search or kind of go on Mind or kind of many of the places that talk about PMDD, it can also be referred to as, like I said previously, a serotonin deficiency, which is why for some people who have PMDD, they are prescribed SSRIs, so antidepressants, to support with the kind of the changes in mood and the emotional intensity around it. Some studies think it's a genetic component, and I'll get into that a little bit later on, but I think that's kind of something interesting when we start to think about neurodivergence as well and some of the genetic differences that we have. I'm sorry, I just got distracted because my cat is sleeping in his hammock on the window and he's dreaming and his little paws are like doing the running thing. Um, then we can also have this kind of neurosteroidal sensitivity. So like this breakdown in the conversion of progesterone into a neurosteroid called allo. And we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. And then past trauma and stress. So trauma is one of these kind of is one of those beasts that can just kind of exacerbate everything. And we've already done a lot of work kind of on previous what did I say, previous webinars on trauma and the nervous system. So I would kind of tell you to go back to those kind of recordings and have a look at those in relation to understanding why trauma, why stress can affect the nervous system in such a way that it can impact something like PMDD. And I think as well that link between neurodivergence and trauma is a really powerful one as well, especially when we're thinking about things like kind of POTS and dysautonomia and EDS and how these things all kind of intertwine. But that, like I say, is a webinar all on its own, and I believe we've already covered that. So I would always recommend to go back to that. So forgive me for not trying to pronounce these big words on a Wednesday evening. I'm going to say allo. but this is the word on your screen. So aloe is a neurosteroid. It is a chemical in your brain and body that is produced from progesterone during your luteal phase of your cycle. In most people, it works as a natural sedative and it crosses the brain-blood barrier and binds to your GABA receptors and tells the nervous system to settle down. You got to think about it as your body's own kind of built-in wind down mechanism for the second half of your cycle. So how we would expect a typical cycle to go is the aloe kind of rises, it binds to the GABA receptors. GABA helps with this kind of relaxation, this wind down in order to get your body ready for the menses, right? But in a PMDD brain, it backfires. So the GABA receptors that the aloe binds to have become sensitized differently, like through a combination of genetic, stress history, and nervous system wise. We're not quite sure what kind of why the sensitivity is different, but what we are seeing is there is a difference in that sensitivity. So instead of receiving these kind of signals as kind of calming and settling, the brain essentially rejects it. So the wind down mechanism becomes a wind up mechanism. So this is why sometimes the kind of more standard hormonal treatments don't often work for PMDD because you can't just fix a sensitivity problem by adjusting the levels, right? So we can think about this as imagine your nervous system as a smoke alarm. In most brains, the kind of the aloe is something like opening a window when there's a bit of steam in the kitchen. So you just kind of let that steam or that smoke out, and kind of the alarm kind of stays quiet and everything settles. In a PMDD brain, that same steam will trigger a full alarm. The signals that were supposed to say everything is fine gets read as something is very wrong. So the smoke alarm isn't broken, it's just calibrated to go off at a lower threshold. And once it goes off, it's very hard to switch off. So the GABA connection here, right? So we were talking about aloe, we were talking about the GABA receptors. So GABA is your brain's main inhibitory neurotransmitter. Its job is to slow things down, reduce anxiety, quieten reactivity, and help you feel safe, right? GABA is our friend. And we can think about this as the brake pedal for our nervous system. So aloe works by activating a specific type of GABA receptor called the GABA A. In a typical cycle, this is what produces the natural sense of calm that leads up to menstruation, right? In PMDD, the GABA A receptors have adapted and they become less responsive and sometimes work in a reverse way. So the brake pedal doesn't quite work properly, or it accidentally kind of hits the accelerator instead. So this is why this kind of anxiety, irritability, words, right? Irritability and emotional overwhelm don't just increase before your period, they can feel completely overwhelming and unmanageable, right? And it can be one of these things that just feel like they make no sense because nothing external has changed, but everything internal feels very different and feels like the volume is all the way up, right? And then kind of we're also thinking about it's not just kind of GABA misfiring, something else is happening too. So when your estrogen plays a significant role in how well your brain produces and uses serotonin, right? So serotonin we know is the mood chemical. So when we're talking about SSRIs and antidepressants, a lot of the times we're talking about kind of medication that increases the availability of serotonin in your system to help regulate your mood. So I think it's serotonin reuptake inability SSRIs, right? The S stands for serotonin. So when we have a kind of a good amount of serotonin in our systems, it's helping us with our emotional resistance. It's helping us with our impulse regulation, our sleep quality, our pain tolerance, and this kind of general sense that everything's going to be okay. So when we're like, oh yeah, life is a vibe. I've got this. Everything in the gym is going good. Work is going good. Everything just feels like it's going to be all right. It doesn't necessarily mean that anything outside of us has changed. But what we might find is actually our gut is feeling quite healthy, our body's feeling healthy, and we're producing the kind of the right amount of for us of serotonin in order to allow that kind of calmness within our system, right? So in the luteal phase, it's important to understand that estrogen drops, right? Estrogen drops and progesterone goes up. So when the estrogen drops, the serotonin function drops with it. So when our estrogen goes down, our serotonin functioning goes down, which is why when you're even thinking about SSRIs, so antidepressants for PMDD, you don't necessarily need to kind of, and I'm not saying this as a medical as medical advice. I'm saying this in relation to things that I've read, and some of the things that I've read, it's saying you don't necessarily have to take it all through the month. It can be beneficial for the luteal phase and the luteal phase only. Now, I don't know how much that kind of works in real life, because thinking about the half-life of medication, thinking about getting doses right, that might make it a little bit more difficult to manage. But I understand the kind of the theory, the logic behind only taking it kind of in that luteal phase. But practically speaking, I I'd be advised by a doctor or a nurse. So what we're really thinking when we're thinking about PMDD is these kind of two systems dysregulating at one time. So we're thinking about this kind of GABA system. So GABA, that's supposed to help us kind of slow down and relax and calm down. And the serotonin system, which is like the emotional buffer, right? The emotion, the thing that helps us stabilize our mood. So it's basically kind of these two systems kind of intertwining and both dysregulating, which is why the impact of it can feel so huge, because it is a big thing, right? You're not making it up. It's not coming out of nowhere. There's two systems that are dysregulating and that are kind of not working in the way that you'd like it to work. So neither of these alone would necessarily feel unmanageable, but together they can create this kind of window in your cycle where your nervous system has like less capacity to regulate, buffer, or recover. This is not a personal failing. This is two neurochemical systems being pulled in the wrong direction at the same time. Now, bear in mind, when I'm talking to you about this, this is still the information that is relatable to neurotypicals, right? So we haven't even got into the being a neurodivergent woman or a neurodivergent person who menstruates in this conversation yet. This is still, we're talking about neurotypicals, as in most of the, research, most of the things that we talk about is seen through that neurotypical lens. So we can start to see how easy this is when kind of for things to go wrong when we intertwine it with neurodivergence, with something like ADHD. So coming into this neurodivergent link. So everything that we've covered, this kind of misfiring of the GABA system, the serotonin drop, the dysregulated nervous system, it's amplified when you are neurodivergent, right? And it's not a coincidence. There's big reasons why PMDD and neurodivergence intersect so frequently, and yet this is one of the least researched and talked about areas in both fields. So if we think about kind of neurodivergence, right, our baseline is already different, right? So if we think about heightened sensitivity and we think about our nervous systems, we can be thinking about how much information that we're already processing, that we're already taking on in the world. If we're already dealing with dysautonomia, if we're already dealing with FND, right, we already have these hypersensitive nervous systems. So our normal, our day-to-day, our baseline might already be a 30% or a 60% or an 80%, depending on a multitude of factors, right? How many of our needs are being met, how many of our needs are not being met, like kind of how much, access to support are we getting? There's all of these things that might be kind of affecting our baseline. So when we're thinking about PMDD, we're not thinking about the neurotypical baseline. We have to think about it through the lens of the neurodivergent baseline. So this sensory input is more intense. Emotional responses are stronger. Again, we've got that dysautonomia where we can struggle with the emotional regulation, and our kind of our ups and downs can feel a lot more intense. And just regulation in general takes more effort. And when these things take more effort, that's effort on our nervous systems, right? So the window of tolerance, that space where we can function without tipping into overwhelm, is often a lot narrower than our neurotypical peers. So when the luteal phases arise and our neurochemical shifts, we are starting from a place that already has less of a buffer. So just if we think, for example, around ADHD and the luteal phase. So ADHD is significantly shaped by dopamine, the neurotransmitter that drives motivation, focus, and reward. So estrogen supports dopamine function, right? So we already know that estrogen drops in the luteal phase. So not only does kind of that affect serotonin and our serotonin levels, it will also affect our dopamine levels. So our motivation, our focus, our reward, all of this will decrease anyway in a neurodivergent person or a person with ADHD because of how estrogen and dopamine intertwine. Now, it's also documented that there is a strong link between ADHD and GABA deficiency, right? So when we're thinking about kind of, we were talking about before about this kind of GABA deficiency in PMDD. So with ADHD, we can already have that GABA deficiency. So that kind of racing thoughts, what needs to go on, like, when you go into the kitchen to make a cup of tea, and then you go to get the milk out of the fridge. So you open the fridge, you take out the milk, and you go, oh, hang on a minute, I've just remembered that I need to go do something in the bathroom. So you take the milk, and then you leave the milk in the bathroom, you do the thing in the bathroom, and then you go, oh, hang on a minute, I was supposed to do the washing up, or I was supposed to feed the cat. So you go feed the cat, and your brain is kind of looping from one thing to the other thing to the next thing, right? This is around kind of GABA, and not having that kind of GABA deficiency, which is not allowing your brain and your body to slow down. That kind of before sleep and your mind is racing and you can't turn it off. GABA, right? This is why in a lot of sleep supplements, especially when we kind of talk about sports and recovery, for example, a lot of the sleep supplements will have L-theanine in. And L-theanine is great because it's a precursor to GABA. It helps your body and your brain to produce more GABA to calm down your system. So, you know, a lot of the sleep supplements will be using something like L-theanine, and a lot of like the concentration drinks and supplements and powders will also have L-theanine in, which naturally is within green tea. So if you want to kind of get L-theanine naturally into your system, drink green tea in the morning. I wouldn't recommend drinking green tea in the afternoon due to how much caffeine is in it, but just having some green tea or some matcha in your system, kind of in your days, in your habits, can be something that helps promote kind of GABA if we're dealing with a GABA deficiency. So for ADHDers, this can look like executive function collapse almost overnight, tasks that were manageable suddenly feeling impossible, emotional dysregulation that feels completely out of proportion, rejection sensitivity, dysphoria intensifying significantly, and I'll go into that a little bit more. And this kind of existing ADHD medication feeling like it's stopped working, right? And then we can think about some of the research around autism and the luteal phase. So for autistic people, the luteal phase can bring a distinct shift in capacity that isn't always recognized as hormonal. So again, this can, I'm thinking about as well, the overlap between ADHD and autism, and how many, especially women in particular, have AuDHD. So we're not, very rarely, well, not very rarely, but we talk about kind of autism and ADHD as if they're two separate things, but a lot of the time it's more of a Venn diagram in relation to like where the overlap is. So again, we're thinking about sensory sensitivities becoming more significant and more intense, social interactions feeling more exhausting or overwhelming than usual, masking becoming harder to sustain, meltdowns or shutdowns that feel disproportionate to the trigger, a sense of losing access to coping strategies that usually work, increase, I'm not going to say that word. So words are not my forte. So this kind of feeling of finding it hard to identify and name what you're feeling, which is very common in for autistic people, to kind of really be able to sit there and identify kind of what it is what am I feeling, what is going on in my body, and what is the feeling that I attach to that. And it's not just ADHD and autism. And I don't want kind of to create this idea that at Project U, we're only ever thinking about ADHD and autism when we're talking about neurodivergence, because we're not. This is about a hormone cycle that affects the whole nervous system, which means other neurodivergent profiles are impacted, even if the research hasn't kept pace. And that's the big thing here. The research tends to be lacking. So we know even with like Tourette's syndrome, it is a lot, and people who tick. So I'm a person who ticks. Ticking is a lot more common than most people know it is. I think the data, it kind of almost matches autism, but the majority of the money and the majority of the funding goes into kind of autism. And that says a lot, because we know that a lot of autistic people are not represented in research and data, and also don't get their needs met and don't get kind of seen in the system, and there's a lot of late diagnosis. So it's kind of tenfold when we're thinking about something like Tourette syndrome or tics, right? It's an area where there's huge amounts of people that kind of have to kind of deal with tics or deal with Tourette syndrome, and are just kind of absent from research and from data and from funding and getting kind of systems of support up and running. And when we think about neurodivergence, we also have to think about kind of neurodivergence kind of as a whole and being extremely inclusive in that. And, I firmly believe that there are a lot of kind of what would fall under mental health disorders within that neurodivergent banner, right? I think mental health disorders are neurodivergence. It's a divergent from the norm. So we can be thinking about things like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, where research can show that intrusive thoughts, compulsions, and anxiety intensify significantly in the late luteal phase, driven by the same serotonin drop that we discussed earlier. And sorry, I should have said, with people who have Tourette syndrome, tics can kind of increase during that kind of premenstrual phase. So that kind of before period, before menstruation, what we can find is that can be more kind of tic severity in those cases. And for those with dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and other profiles, the research is thin. So there's only so much we can kind of go off of. But what we do know is that kind of in this luteal phase where these hormones are shifting, what we do see is it can affect our cognitive load and our social processing and our regulation capacity. And it's important to understand that the absence of research is not the same as the absence of impact. Okay. Research needs to get kind of caught up. It does not mean that kind of just because your symptoms or your experience doesn't fit neatly into these kind of ADHD autism boxes, it doesn't mean that it's not affecting you. It just means that it has not been studied yet, or there is not enough research. And this is why it's important that we continue kind of talking about these things. Every time we talk about these things, it's not just kind of about education and information. It's part of social justice. It's about kind of creating places where we are seen and we are heard, and we can kind of push back and help create a society that meets our needs better. So I just want to kind of go back to rejection sensitivity, because we know rejection sensitivity is very prevalent in people with ADHD or autistic people, and it's the kind of emotional response to perceived or actual rejection or criticism. And in the luteal phase, with the kind of the dopamine and the serotonin both depleted, the nervous system is already dysregulated. So that kind of rejection sensitivity can almost become like completely unbearable. So, and rejection sensitivity doesn't have to be big things. It can be like a text that goes unanswered, a comment that lands wrong, a perceived slight that in another week would barely register, or things that, in the first week of your cycle, they're not going to have as big as an effect, but actually during the luteal phase, that sensitivity can become kind of almost physically painful, right? It can become a physical experience in your body, and these things are not kind of made up. They're not in your mind, right? These are very real symptoms to a very real kind of disorder and reaction in your body. So in the luteal phase, it can feel like the evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with you, but it isn't. It's your neurobiology. It's a neurobiological event happening in a very specific window of your cycle, okay? And I think there's this additional part of it as well when we start to think about masking. So especially when we think about neurodivergent women, um, and how we have spent kind of so many years masking, and sometimes so many years, kind of decades masking, and this kind of adaptation, this performance, this suppressing, this translating ourselves for a world that just wasn't designed for us, right? And masking itself, if you have to go into the office, if you have to kind of go to a commercial gym, right? Go in, or if you have to kind of be social, masking itself is exhausting under normal circumstances. So when the luteal phase hits, you know, it can just deplete us of so much. So the cost of masking increased significantly. What if you want to use spoon theory, going to work for the day in the office, masking might cost you 2 spoons. During the luteal phase, when you've had this dopamine drop, this serotonin drop, masking might cost you 9 spoons, right? It can feel very different throughout the month. Now, this is when many neurodivergent women describe the luteal phase as the time when the mask slips or falls off entirely. And then what happens is we might have a meltdown, or we might kind of have more conflict than usual. We might have behave in a way that is seen as unusual or untypical for us, or not meet the societal standards of kind of quote unquote normal. And then we feel like this abundance of shame afterwards. And that kind of feeds into this cycle of kind of trauma and stress, right? And mask slipping is not a failure. It's your nervous system just telling you that you've run out of the capacity to perform. Okay. So there's another thing that I want to just kind of bring up as well, or a couple of things, because I see this less in research and less kind of spoken about. And there is bits and bobs of research out there, but I think it's important to kind of put these links together, right? MCAS and histamine. We've spoken about this a million and one times, right? So with neurodivergence, we tend to see genetic mutations and genetic differences. And one of those being the way that we process histamine, how we kind of detox it out of our body, how it can build up in our body, or kind of everything around mast cells, right? And we need to understand that there is a relationship between estrogen and a mast cell release, and kind of histamines, right? So histamine stimulates more estrogen. So if you've got a body that is struggling with histamine and has a histamine buildup and isn't detoxing histamine properly, then what you might find is you have more estrogen in your system. But then estrogen itself also creates more histamine. So it gets caught in this loop of histamine, estrogen, histamine, estrogen, histamine, estrogen, right? And these can kind of create inflammatory, allergic, kind of an inflammatory allergic reaction. So flushing, gut flares, joint pain, body-based anxiety, and this may be part of your kind of bigger, wider picture. And I think it's important to understand the link between raised histamine levels and joint pain, for example, right? Um, so when we're thinking about kind of interventions and how we work with PMDD, actually we have to think through a different lens when we're working with neurodivergent people, right? And people that menstruate who are neurodivergent, because we have to be taking into consideration MCAS. We have to take into consideration kind of how they're dealing with histamine. MCAS can also cause huge amounts of anxiety, brain fog, issues with concentration. So the interlink there is huge and phenomenal. And there is research that showcase how MCAS can influence and trigger PMDD, as well as many other psychiatric disorders, such as OCD, for example, right? Um, oh, I thought I had a slide on it. Turn out I don't have as many slides as I thought I was going to have. I pulled the slides back thinking I wasn't going to have enough, and I can see I've got 20 minutes left of my webinar, and I'm going to be done in about 5 minutes. So if you have questions, now is the time to start thinking about them and putting them in the chat, for those of you who are here live. Hypermobility and EDS, POTS, dysautonomia. I didn't put a slide in here in the end because I didn't think I was going to have enough time. But these things all kind of play into this wider picture, especially FND as well, right? So nervous system issues. So if you already have a sensitivity in your nervous system, then you're more prone to have these reactions to hormonal changes, right? Because your nervous system is already again operating on this more highly sensitive plane. And there was something I wanted to say about EDS, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I knew I should have put the slide in there. I think there's also something around kind of the hormonal fluctuations and how they feel in a body, in a hypermobile body, or in a body that is highly sensitive. And I think we also have to take into consideration that, again, when we're thinking about research, is it taken into consideration what does it feel like to be in a disabled body? What does it feel like when your estrogen drops and your pain levels rise? And then you're also having to deal with the dopamine. You also have to the lack of dopamine, the lack of GABA, the lack of serotonin in a body that is in a lot of pain, in a body that is struggling to regulate anyway. So I think when we're thinking about these kind of neurodivergent issues, the one thing that I tend to see missed a lot when we're thinking about PMDD is thinking about the link between MCAS and histamine, but then also the wider link between MCAS, EDS, and dysautonomia and POTS. Now, what actually helps? What are the things that we want to do? Now, this is your baseline, right? This is where we start. This is the kind of the fundamentals. So blood sugar stability, particularly in the luteal phase, when the carbohydrate cravings increase, is is going to be one of the hardest things, right? Because in that luteal phase, we're going to be reducing dopamine in our system. So we're going to be wanting it more. We're going to be searching for it more. And one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to snack a lot more. And that snacking is going to kind of create an instability with our blood sugar, right? So when we're thinking about food and meal prep and meal planning, we need to be thinking ahead in relation to like, what does luteal phase kind of look like? Kind of how do I think about my meals and my kind of blood, kind of, how do I stabilize my blood? So for example, I'm currently in my luteal phase. My plan for today, especially because I knew I was working late, was eat bigger during the front end of the day. So I had made sure I had a big breakfast and a big lunch. And that meant that I wanted to snack less throughout the day. I also was aware of kind of what snacks do I have in the house and making sure that I don't have too many, but also giving myself some snacks because, darling, ADHD, give me something, right? So I made sure I had some dark chocolate. I had a no, I'll tell a lie. I had a dark chocolate digestive biscuit, okay? It wasn't as clean cut as just dark chocolate. We're all starting somewhere, right? And then kind of I had a clean dinner, so I had vegetables and chicken, right? For my dinner with no carbs. But I carb loaded. I had my carbs for the day during my breakfast and my lunch in order just to be able to kind of stabilize my blood sugar, but also stabilize my energy throughout the day. It also means that I can finish up here. I don't need to eat anything now, and I can just hydrate before I go to bed. And this can now be about my bedtime routine, right? So speaking of dark chocolate, magnesium is a big part of this. So magnesium supports GABA function, sleep, progesterone metabolism, and many people are deficient and don't know about it. And there are kind of different types of magnesium that you might want to try. So magnesium glycate, magnesium citrate, there are many, and it's about kind of working with your kind of practitioner, whoever you might be working with. I think it kind of people might have different reactions to different ones, and you can use different kind of magnesiums for kind of different reasons. I think the magnesium glycate is the best one for kind of GABA function and sleep, and it tends to be what's in the sleep supplements. That's for, for those of you who are in the webinar that have been working with me, why kind of one of the reasons that kind of I was checking, like, are you still on your magnesium tablets or supplements? Are you still taking your B complex? Because these are the things that can affect that kind of increase in PMDD symptoms. So B6 would be another one. B6, the research is also showing that in a P5P formula. So it just means that it's just how the B6 is kind of synthesized and made in like this active supplement, right? So supplements can be formed in different ways. Omega-3 for inflammation and mood. I mean, we all should be probably having a lot more omega-3 than we currently do. So omega-3, you can get it through fish. So the acronym that I was taught in kind of school when I was training is SMASH fish. So salmon, mackerels, anchovies, sardines, and herring. I kind of say if you want to get like an A star, kind of wild salmon is better than farm salmon, but I know that it can also be very expensive and can have different textures as well. But like smash fish, oily fish, right? You can also get omega-3 supplements. Also can get omega-3 in things like chia seeds and flax seeds. So omega-3s is always kind of good for your nervous system anyway. I even give it to my cats because, they love me some omega-3s. The big one is always going to be, and it's for PMDD, but just neurodivergence in general, adequate protein at every meal, right? Adequate protein throughout the day. Looking at about 30 to 40 grams of protein at every meal. Again, that will also help stabilize your blood sugar. It will help keep you full, and it will just help keep everything kind of in kind of regulation, right? So these would be my fundamentals. If you have MCAS or kind of histamine as part of your picture, we'd also be thinking about maybe a low histamine diet. Um, Depending on what your symptoms are across the board, that can be for the whole month. But maybe people might kind of struggle with it a little bit more, as in it can be quite a restrictive diet, especially if you're going out. So it might work more for just your luteal phase, just to see if there are any results to see if anything changes through your luteal phase. I always recommend anyone that's kind of dealing with histamine issues like MCAS to try it for at least a month. So you go through a whole cycle and see what see how your symptoms reduce. Um, Especially those that have had COVID, long COVID. I think there's definitely a link between long COVID and histamine and MCAS. Quercetin is also very good. It's found naturally in things like red onions, apples, capers, berries. It can also be taken as a supplement. So if you get really bad hay fever as well, quercetin is one of those things that can be really good. And supporting the DOA, so that's the enzyme that breaks down histamine in the gut. Now with neurodivergence, we tend to see either we can see in neurodivergent a mutation in the DAO enzyme, right? Not everyone, it's not if you're ADHD, you definitely have this. I still think that there's clusters of us that the mutations are different. So some might have their MTHFR mutation and others might have the DOA, right? But it means that kind of how is histamine breaking down? So in order to support the DOA enzyme, you can actually take the supplement, but you can also, again, through B6, through vitamin C, and through copper, can make a meaningful difference for some people. But I'd always recommend working with a practitioner like myself or someone else that genuinely understands MCAS and kind of the hormone connection. Gut, movement, and sleep. So just kind of three more things that we want to be thinking about. Gut bacteria. So there is gut bacteria that's responsible for clearing estrogen. Um, you know, it can help. There's gut bacteria. If estrogen is not being cleared away properly, it can also drive the mast cell activation and worsen the luteal phase. But I also think kind of gut health in these kind of conditions are really important to look after anyway, or to look into, because a lot of the time when someone has issues with their gut health, there will be a link with PMDD. Not all the time. It's not kind of cause and reaction. It's more kind of correlation that we can see an overlap here. And, you know, especially kind of gut bacteria is one of those things that I would be looking at. So if I'm seeing bloating, for example, and PMDD, I might be thinking about gut bacteria. I might also be thinking about nervous system. You know, it's not one thing causes everything, but you'll be kind of looking at kind of what are potentially intersecting here, right? Um, movement across the pattern, kind of movement across the cycle can matter more than movement in general. So this isn't a case of every person who menstruates shouldn't be kind of doing high intensity work during the luteal phase. I don't necessarily kind of believe that you have to train around your cycle, but if you're experiencing PMDD, then you might actually want to take into consideration movement and training around your cycle, because if you know you have, you know, you're dealing with PMDD, which is about this kind of heightened nervous system reaction, then what you might want to do is reduce some of the intensity on your nervous system when you're thinking about kind of your gym and cardio and kind of how much you're putting your central nervous system through in that kind of week prior to your menstrual cycle. However, I would always say work with your coach and see what works best for you, because actually what you might find is you have so much anger and rage, you need to do something. So you might need a way of kind of releasing some of that energy. So I don't want to say, you know, if you're experiencing this, don't train, because that might be counterintuitive, right? It's just a thing to think about. How does movement, how does, you know, how does recovery after movement play into kind of getting your needs met throughout your cycle? And sleep is going to disrupt everything that we spoke about today. So one of the biggest things that you can do is prioritize sleep hygiene, specifically in the luteal phase. What is your bedtime routine? How are you going to sleep? Is there kind of regularity there? We have done a lot of work at Project U on sleep hygiene. If you need any handouts, give me a shout in the app and I will put them in the app. But sleep hygiene is always one of the things that we want to be working on, okay? So kind of lastly, how to advocate for yourself. Oh, look, my timing is actually quite perfect. Well done, me. Many of you will have kind of symptoms dismissed, right? This is part of medical care, right? We know that we can interact with NHS, with doctors, with GPs, nurses, and sometimes feel like we're not being heard, that we're not being seen. Not all the time, but I know with neurodivergence in particular, a lot of us feel a lack of confidence going to speak to a healthcare provider. So I just want to acknowledge that, you know, we can feel like our symptoms are dismissed quite a lot in this, and navigating through these medical systems, you know, we have to learn that it's a practical skill. It's not a personality trait, right? It's a thing that we might have to learn to do, and it might take more spoons than a neurotypical, and we might need a little bit of support around it. We might have to just kind of build up our resilience around that. I know from firsthand experience, I personally hate going to the doctors for anything, especially now everything is online and it's supposed to be easier. But what do you mean? I have to go on 3 different websites, then an app, and remember a password just to get an appointment, and then there's probably not an appointment there anyway. Like, um, so some of the things that we can be doing is tracking our symptoms against our cycle before any appointment. I will say there are some good apps out there. I personally like Natural Cycles. I'm not sponsored by them in any way, shape, or form. I get nothing from you for telling you about them. They are a paid app, but what they can do is help track your cycle, and then every day you can put your symptoms in there. If you wear an Aura ring, for example, it will also link in with your Aura ring, so you don't have to manually take your temperature every morning. It does it all for you. So tracking your symptoms. So rather than it being like, oh, I feel terrible sometimes, being able to show that this is a consistent pattern over time during a very specific window in your menstrual cycle. Okay. Again, so for those of you that kind of working with me, what you'll see is I do track in the weekly feedback forms. I do track where you're at in your cycle as well, so we can start to see kind of if symptoms are kind of part of the fluctuation of the hormones, right? The estrogen and the progesterone kind of going up and down. Know what you're asking for. So whether that's a hormone panel, a Dutch test. A Dutch test is again a kind of very thorough um a hormonal and endocrine test. You know, it goes through a lot of different things, but you just it's called a Dutch test. So you Google a Dutch test to understand what it is. Um, Knowing if you want a conversation about the luteal phase or SSRIs, um, a referral to someone who knows more about kind of MCAS or hypermobility, EDS. Going in with a specific request is more likely to get a useful outcome than going in with general descriptions of struggle. And if you are dismissed, just always remember that says more about the practitioner than it says about you and your experience. Okay. So don't get disheartened if practitioners aren't aware of these things and they push back or they might dismiss you. Keep pushing, keep advocating for yourself. If you're working with me, I can always write you a doctor's letter as well and give you that additional bit of support. Okay. So key takeaways today: PMDD, it's a neurobiological condition, so it's in the brain and the body, and it has a specific hormonal trigger. It's not a mood disorder, and it's not you being too much. Being neurodivergent, hypermobile, or living with MCAS means the luteal phase hits a bit harder, and has there's real biological reasons for that. The complexity of your experience is real, and even if it has not been named properly, until now. There are things that can help, not a cure, not a protocol that works for everyone, but a direction of travel that is worth pursuing with the right support. Does anyone have any questions in the chat? I'm going to give you a moment to do that. Before I go into questions, just for those that are watching online, just to let you know that Project U Academy is a neurodivergent specialist fitness and well-being business supporting neurodivergent women to reduce burnout, improve physical and mental health, and build sustainable routines that work with their brains. The organization combines fitness, lifestyle, and neurodivergent coaching to address gaps in traditional approaches designed for neurotypical clients and provide support unavailable or inaccessible via other methods. By redesigning coaching systems around executive functioning, energy regulation, and accessibility, Project U delivers higher long-term well-being outcomes, making consistency finally attainable and reduce the stress and shame and embarrassment that comes with looking after yourself as a neurodivergent person. If you would like to inquire about working with us, please reach out via our social media channels. If you don't know what to say, you can just say the word inquiry and we will get a message back to you to talk through the process together.